Good morning and welcome. My name is Nick Cull. I am Director of the Master's Program in Public Diplomacy here at USC, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the annual conference of the Association of Public Diplomacy Scholars. And this year we have the title, Public Diplomacy on the Frontlines. Whenever anybody asks me what's the best thing about being at USC, about teaching at USC, I always have one answer. And people expect that I'll say something about the weather, or the freedom I have to travel around, or the research support, or the fantastic colleagues I have. And whilst all of these are true, it's not the first thing that I talk about, because the first thing for me about being here is the amazing quality of the students who come to study in the master's program in public diplomacy. And we're in this amazing situation of having being able to recruit pretty much whoever we want from some fantastic applicants every year. People who, by the nature of getting up one morning and saying, I know what I want to do, I want to be a master's student in public diplomacy, are self-selecting themselves as people who have got a keen eye on the way the world is changing, who understand something about the changing dynamics of foreign policy in the contemporary age, and who are self-starters. And having a body of students who are self-starters, who are people who show initiatives, who are people who are able to already work across international frontiers, means that they're able to take a tremendous role in the running of their own program. And among the things that the students do is organize a wonderful journal, Public Diplomacy Magazine, to do all sorts of research work with the Center on Public Diplomacy, and generate all sorts of exciting blog pieces. But one of the most important things the students do is every year organize this wonderful conference. Past conferences have dealt with issues like the future, city diplomacy. We've had one on peace building and conflict resolution. And this year, we're looking particularly at issues of conflict. I want to, before introducing our first speaker, I want to acknowledge the amazing work of the two students who took the lead in organizing the concert. The conference. Yes, there's got to be singing too now. The conference, that's Alex Ristovich and Sarah Myers. So please. It's a wonderful job. I also want to say how much I know that Alex and Sarah have been well supported by other students, especially Kelsey, Alex, and Ariana. So, and thanks for all you guys have done, and other volunteers. There are a number of volunteers here today. It's been essential to have support from Professor Philip Sieb and the Center on Public Diplomacy. And it's good to see Shireen Badawi-Walton here as well. The whole center has been very, very supportive, and we thank you. And maybe it's a good moment to say thank you, Phil, for the support you've given to the master's program over the whole period of your tenure at CPD. It's much appreciated. Thank you. It's a pleasure to look out and see colleagues from Annenberg and around the university here, and also to see alumni and to see people who are associated with the consulates in Los Angeles supporting us here today. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to the speakers who are an essential part of proceedings. We really value your coming out to spend time with us and to be involved in this discussion of public diplomacy. All of you have come a long way. Some of you have come a very long way, and thank you very much for being here. Our first speaker, it's a great pleasure to introduce David Ensor, the director of Voice of America. since we last met, one of our graduates, Matthew Armstrong, has become, in a manner of speaking, or will soon become, in a manner of speaking, one of the, do you think of the Broadcasting Board of Governors as your bosses, or people at the edge who, and there are people there, well, there you go. So he now works for one of you. How does that feel? In more than just a capacity of being a taxpayer, which is a good, I think Matt's success is a great testament to the wider success of the program, but it's a pleasure to have David here. The students have all read Histories of Voice of America. They're very steeped in the lore of VOA, and so I hope you feel that you're, you can be sure that you're among friends, and you're welcome to this conference, and thank you so much for taking the time to be here, David. So the floor is yours.
Well, good morning, and thank you for inviting me. Nick, thank you for a kind introduction, and Phil, an old friend, and I hope for many years to come to be seeing you in Washington as well as here. I've been the director of the Voice of America for about 2 years now, and prior to that I was a diplomat in the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. And I spent 32 years as a television and radio journalist at first National Public Radio, and then ABC News, and then CNN. So there's ink in my veins. My passion is journalism. And so it was a particular pleasure to come back to lead a journalistic organization like Voice of America when I was invited to do that by the Board of Governors that Matt may soon be on if the Senate agrees. You always have to say, you know, if the Senate agrees. They usually do, but they don't always. So I'm just going to dive right into a talk I've prepared, and then I'd be happy to take I'll try to go quickly so that I can leave a little time for discussion or questions if that's possible. But I know there's a panel next, so I'll try not to overstay. There's an interesting building in Beijing. It's something of an engineering marvel, and there's a picture of it. It's an extraordinary statement in steel and glass that's much discussed in architecture classes, and some of you are from China and probably know which building this is. It's the headquarters of China Central Television, or CCTV, which is a very ambitious organization. Back in 2009, the then Chinese leader Hu Jintao announced plans to put nearly $9 billion over 2 years into what was called external publicity work. Most of the money went to 4 entities: CCTV, China Radio International, Xinhua News Agency, and the China Daily Newspaper. And CCTV now has a slick news channel aimed at delivering China-centric news to U.S. audiences and to 5 other international audiences in different languages. They are trying to go head-to-head with the likes of my old employers, CNN, and the BBC and Al Jazeera, and build a favorable worldview of the People's Republic. 8.7 billion, which is the number, is a lot of money. And China's not the only nation that has decided to go into the satellite TV business and try to build up what Harvard's Joseph Nye so famously called soft power. RT, the Russian, the Kremlin channel, is now available on cable systems all over this country. Press TV, the mouthpiece of the Iranian Ayatollahs, is also pouring a lot of money into the effort. The Chinese, the Russians, the Iranians, and quite a few others are putting billions into the competition for hearts and minds. So please keep that in context, that context in mind, as I now tell you about the Voice of America and what it does for our country. The last time some of you heard of VOA, some of you who are a little older, may have been as a Cold War shortwave radio station. Well, it's certainly not that anymore. Voice of America is the largest of the U.S. government's 5 civilian international broadcast stations, and every week more than 150 million people around the world are reached by VOA. And we use every platform we can. We call ourselves platform agnostic. And our programs are broadcast on AM, FM, shortwave, satellite. They are streamed on the web, and we do programming distribution by mobile phones, along with podcasts and tweets. One size does not fit all. We have a tailored approach for each market. It could be shortwave radio and satellite TV for a poor play area, or what we call a denied area. But in more open markets like Indonesia or Latin America, we use an affiliate strategy, serving as a kind of a Washington bureau or a US bureau, doing stand-ups and cut-ins and features and using Skype and satellite and social media to complement on their own programming what the Indonesians and other Latin Americans that I've just mentioned are doing on their shows. We currently broadcast in 45 languages. That's up from 43 about 3 months ago, because there's 2 new languages in Mali we've just added. I've got a staff of about 1,700 people. A little over 1,000 of those are in a building in Washington, and the rest are all over the world. We produce news, music, information programs in Albanian, Burmese, Mandarin, Hausa, Farsi, Russian, Chinese, Tigrinya, Tibetan, Vietnamese, and those are just a few. The aim of the first VOA broadcast back in 1942, 71 years ago, was to reach closed societies, in particular Germany. The goal was to provide an alternative to Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels, not a competitor. On its first broadcast, VOA said, "The news may be good, the news may be bad, we shall tell you the truth." And the news was mostly bad for about 2 years with German victories in the fighting. The Allies kept losing. Today, our broadcasts are guided by the principles of a VOA charter that's been part of US law since 1976, which protects us from those who sometimes argue that we should beat our adversaries over the head with propaganda-style programs. In its most boiled-down form, the charter says our programs must be accurate, objective, and comprehensive. And I've skipped a page somehow. I've gotten all mixed up here. Never mind. The beauty of it is that we speak directly to the people in the places we're broadcasting, including places like North Korea, Iran, northern Mali, where the US government has virtually no other means of direct communication. And let me be clear, this is not a propaganda operation. I wouldn't want to be part of it if it was. It's journalism the old-fashioned way, with the goals of accuracy and balance, and I think that's far more powerful. And these are some pictures relevant to the old days, if you will. That's the first broadcast on the left, Edward R. Murrow in the middle, who was the first USAIA director, and I suspect most of you students have studied at one point or another. And on the right, well, we brought jazz to Eastern Europe. This year, there have been some changes made in the law governing Voice of America. There were regulations that barred us from sharing our programs domestically in the United States with the people the people who actually pay for them, the taxpayers here. And that law has now been amended so that in some limited ways we are going to be able to share our materials in this country. It's going to lead to some interesting new possibilities for us, and actually it's something I'm hoping to talk to USC about, because there's the potential for some sharing that may be of interest academically as well. But listen, or I'm going to skip some of this because it's sort of a speech this is too sophisticated an audience for me to go through what the principles are behind our broadcasting. Let me just put it this way: we're in the trust business. As journalists like to say, you're only as good as your last story. Credibility is what we are all about. And some of the largest impact in the world that we've had over time has come when we were reporting honestly about America's mistakes. Abu Ghraib, with that story told warts and all, built our audience globally, built our credibility, as did Watergate before it. But fast forward now to 2013, where pictures on an iPhone or YouTube or Twitter can set off violent reactions half a world away. We've seen what happens when a pastor in Florida threatens to burn a Quran, or when clips from a crudely made Muslim-hating movie trailer are pushed out onto social media platforms in the Middle East. Communications technology and social media are revolutionizing the way we get our news and how ideas spread. public diplomacy, which has frankly always been more important than the State Department gives it credit for, is now even more so. America needs to find ways to go viral with its message in order to get the world's attention. Recently, the head of our China branch, Sasha Gong, responded to something the new Chinese premier said about his, quote, dreams for the Chinese nation. She has an account on a Chinese microblog where she wrote, quote, the Chinese dream was a collective dream with a single color, while the American dream was an individual's dream with a multitude of colors. And she went on to write, I had been dreaming of free speech since I was a child, but only in America did I find a huge microphone for myself. That post was viewed more than 16 million times throughout China and resent to many more. Just the other day on Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter, followers asked her to respond to a comment by a local propaganda department which claimed that the United States views China as an enemy. Sasha wrote, quote, in the United States, people are free to watch CCTV, to purchase the People's Daily, to access Chinese websites, to hang China's national flag. Can China open to the United States in the same way? Who is regarding whom as an enemy? Within one day, this post was viewed 130,000 times and retweeted many more, just underscoring that simple person-to-person messages that can get through the cracks, get through the censorship apparatus in different societies, can sometimes be more powerful than a television program or a radio show that goes on for years. Now, I'm asking your indulgence for a moment here to show you a video clip, and I'm suspecting that most of you will recognize it.
Open Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style.
Okay, so everybody knows that one, right? Psy, the South Korean pop sensation. This video has been viewed well over 500 million times globally. It's a phenomenon. And as some of you may know, that is not a coincidence. As NPR reported recently, quote, it's not some viral fluke. South Korea has been building up to this moment for 20 years, creating record labels, recruiting young people, and turning them into superstars. In other words, the export of South Korean pop culture has become an important element of the country's image, not just as a maker of cars and electronics, but as a trendy world power. It's the projection of the national brand. It attracts an audience, and it's something the Koreans set out very deliberately to do. It's Korean soft power. It's also an opportunity for some American public diplomacy.
Open Gangnam Style. Gangnam Style.
Blow up. Blow up. Blow up. Blow up. 一下子就火起来了. Have you heard that crazy new song, Gangnam Style? It's blowing up right now. 哎，你听没听过 Gangnam Style 这首很疯狂的新歌曲啊？一下子就火起来了。Global phenomenon. Global.
Oh, sorry. Wait. Will it sit? Yeah. Okay. Is it frozen? I hope it is. Yes. Good. Well, that's VOA's Jessica Beinecke. And she speaks pretty good Mandarin. And from the kitchen table of her apartment in New York City, with little more than a MacBook Pro in her imagination, she creates a Chinese language English teaching video blog called OMG Mayu. Jessica became an internet sensation after one of her episodes called Yucky Gunk went viral. Her ideas come from her audience, and she picks up on trends. She knows what Chinese young people are talking about and how to become part of that conversation. Fans interact with her on Weibo. She engages the audience. If it's current, she talks about it. Her show offers something unique, in this case, a window into the language and expressions being used by young Americans. China is an important market for us, and as you've noticed, I'm spending a certain amount of time talking about it. It's an important focus for American diplomacy and trade relations. And that's why we tried to step up our game with a 2-hour daily live television program that airs on the most popular direct-to-home satellite in China. What we offer is more than hard news, though we do have hard news on there. We also have features like Error 405, which is a segment that serves up what the Communist Party is censoring today on the internet. And we show the actual sites. You want to know what you can't see? Here it is. Watch it. And we also have a segment called History's Mysteries on what the party doesn't tell you about Chinese history. So what we're trying to do is do something that isn't in the marketplace, that will draw maybe not a huge audience, but a sizable audience that's interested in knowing what they're not being told elsewhere. As I mentioned earlier, we're program platform agnostic. Because satellite TV is showing the most growth in China and some other places, we're working hard to get more good shows, TV and audio, onto satellites. In Russia, where we were forced off of the terrestrial affiliate stations we had several years ago that we'd gotten when Boris Yeltsin was president, we were forced off them by Vladimir Putin when he came into power. So we've adopted an all-digital approach with a dynamic website and a cutting-edge TV show that airs on Ustream. It's sort of a guerrilla warfare on TV, but it's a show that where the audience decides what it's going to be about by SMS, by tweets. They say what they'd like to talk about the following week, and we try to get experts, hopefully Russian-speaking experts, onto the set to talk about the issues that the young audience in Russia would like to talk about. Since 2008. Visits to our Russian website have doubled every year, and traffic to the VOA Russian YouTube channel is up with about 1 million views a month now. We also have a budding relationship with some popular independent media outlets. We're doing, for example, live shots for the Russian Business Channel twice a day out of Wall Street. In addition to online programs, like the one I just talked about in Russian, VOA is moving aggressively now into programming on this device. This is the biggest communications revolution that human beings are experiencing right now. When I was in Afghanistan, I was meeting goat herds who had cell phones and who would rather go hungry than not pay the $2 a month to keep the cell phone. It is completely changing people's lives. I recently returned from a week-long visit to Nigeria and Mali. In Nigeria, one of our biggest audiences in the world, I signed a new SMS agreement, which is distributing news headlines and short news topics on phones to people in northern Nigeria in the language of Hausa. In Mali, we're using every platform we can think of. When radical Islamists took over the northern part of the country last year, shutting down independent affiliate stations and intimidating reporters, VOA established a mobile website called Mali One that offered cell phone users special reports in French and in Songhai, which is one of the local languages spoken in the north. We've since added another local language, Bambara, which is actually the main language of southern Mali, and which I'm happy to say so far the BBC and Radio France Internationale have not gone into, giving us a large audience that they haven't reached to. We've also put up a new FM transmitter in cooperation with the government in Bamako, so we've got a big potential audience there as well, and we're quite excited. I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit and go to Iran. In national security terms, one of our most important markets, clearly. Outside of U.S. international broadcasting, VOA and our sister station Radio Free Europe, the United States has basically almost no other way of communicating with the Iranian people. We have no diplomatic relations, we have no embassies, no trade, no American companies in Tehran, no cultural exchanges to speak of, The media environment is tightly controlled. State media are virulently anti-American. And there are deep tensions, of course, as we know, between our country and Iran over support for terrorism, Tehran's nuclear program, and of course, Israel. But listen to this. Every week, VOA television programs are watched by more than 20% of the adult population of Iran. That's 20% of the whole adult population, not just the ones that have satellite dishes. So 1 in 5 watches us at least once a week. And this is on direct-to-home dish, which can be difficult to use. You have to go out on your roof or on the back and get that dish lined up with the right satellite. It's a challenge, but people in Iran are up to it, it seems. At a cost of about $18 million a year, the 200 people who work for me in the Persian service produce 6 hours a day of original programming in Farsi. Contrast that with the capabilities of the Iranian state TV, which employs about 46,000 people and has an annual budget of $1 billion. So for 18 million bucks, we have a fifth of the country tuning in. Quite frankly, a bargain for the American taxpayer. In a way, I suppose we should take Iran's efforts to jam our satellite broadcasts and block our internet programs as a kind of a backhanded compliment. They do try to block them. They sometimes jam them. They are not entirely successful. The programs do get through. Sometimes they're blocked in parts of Tehran and parts of major cities. But generally speaking, people can see them if they really want to. Late last year, VOA programs carried images and reports from demonstrations that took place at Tehran's main bazaar. Soon after that, Iran began jamming the direct-to-home satellite that carries the VOA, BBC, and other international broadcasters. After an international outcry over the violation of telecommunications rules, Iranian programs that were actually on the same satellite were pulled off by the owners of the satellite company, which is partially owned by the French government. The intermittent jamming, as I said, continues today, but it doesn't stop our broadcasts from reaching the public. And we do have some tricks up our sleeve. We work hard on circumvention technologies designed to make it possible for Iranians to find our material on the web, even though it is being blocked. We're constantly, it's a cat and mouse game that goes on every day. This happens also in other countries. So let me take you now to Burma briefly, where we're doing some interesting work now because the country's opening up. Last year I had the honor of hosting the Nobel Prize winner who you see here, Aung San Suu Kyi, in my office. She made VOA one of her first stops on her first trip to the United States because she wanted to personally thank the Burmese service for keeping hope alive. And she told us that she still listens every morning to our news programs. I took her to meet the people in the Burmese service, and here's this sort of major world figure, and she was asking for the autographs of some of the people who do radio to Burma, to Myanmar, out of our building. I've been talking about the variety of programs we have and the effects of the revolution in human communications that's currently underway and how it's forcing change but also offering opportunities to us. That was also true in my last job, as I mentioned, in Kabul, Afghanistan, where I served as Director of Communications at the embassy. In Afghanistan, 65% of the country is, yes, good, is under the age of 25. 65% under 25. After 30 years of war, what those young people want is hope. And I used to say there that I was in the hope business. I was trying to give those young people a sense that their country was worth staying and trying to help rebuild. Here's a clip of an Afghan cop show that the embassy funded, designed to illustrate, in fiction at least, that the police are supposed to go after the bad guys. Then, yeah, he got it. Didn't blow up. Again, then there are the cell phones. The cell phones are the big story. Imagine being a woman in a walled family compound in southern Afghanistan. You might not venture out of it for weeks. But if you get a mobile phone, it means you can talk to your friends, you can call a doctor if you need one, you can call the police. It changes your sense of the possibilities of life enormously. We worked hard to help the phone companies, there were 4 of them, 4 for-profit companies in Afghanistan, to extend their coverage with a network of new towers and capabilities that made it harder for the Taliban to disrupt phone service. We really felt that that was an important communications win for the Afghan people that we could help to contribute to. Coming back to the Voice of America, the VOA plays a critical role on the world stage, but it receives very little attention at home because we've been barred by law until now from sharing our material with audiences in the United States. As I mentioned, recent amendments to that law go into effect July 2nd, and they should allow us to build greater awareness of our impact, particularly in this country's large and influential diaspora communities. In the past, if a radio station requested, for example, a VOA Somali program to broadcast to Somali immigrants in Minnesota, and this did happen a couple of years ago, we had to refuse. We had to say, no, sorry, it's against the law. We are currently drafting the regulations that should spell out how we will handle such domestic requests in the future, and I'm hopeful that we will be able to build greater understanding among Americans, the people who pay for Voice of America, what a good value it is. And in particular in diaspora communities who care, passionately, one hopes and one believes, about the country they came from as well as this one, and who want to make sure that those people have access to information as well. They understand more than anybody the value of VOA, and quite frankly, in a time of tight budgets in Washington, when sequestration just caused us to have to cut 8% and so forth, I'm out partly here today, and I'm making a couple of other talks on the West Coast in this week, saying to people, you might want to talk to your elected representatives about this. Soft power matters. Our country should be good at it. We were good at it during the Cold War. I think we are quite good at it now, but there are big efforts being made by others. I started on Chinese soft power. Should we be concerned about it? About 100 people now work in the CCTV Washington Bureau, some Chinese, and some are old colleagues of mine from my days at CNN and ABC News. In a recent article in Foreign Policy magazine, Western reporters hired to work for CCTV said they were told the idea is, quote, for this to be not a Chinese mouthpiece, not a Chinese propaganda tool, but a global channel produced with Chinese flair, which sounds good. But what does this global channel say with its Chinese flair? CCTV recently reported about the Tibetans who have been self-immolating themselves, committing suicide by fire to protest Chinese treatment of Tibet. More than 100 have now done so. And the CCTV report, looking to figure out why, blamed it on Voice of America. The Tibetans, said CCTV, are being encouraged to kill themselves by VOA. And the Chinese broadcaster claimed that VOA news reports on these tragic incidents are somehow embedded with secret messages from the Dalai Lama.
当时为什么要做这件事情呢？
我在那个美国之音看的是最后想知道。
美国之音里说了什么？
Сюда не начинается я как сказал. Да ты работа шахтан жамука. Да диджей да шахтан барады como.
The Western media, like Voice of America and Radio Free Asia, have been very useful to the Dalai clique. Since the 1990s, they have been increasing their Tibetan language output. Apart from regular Tibetan language programs, Voice of America, at a request of the Dalai clique, broadcasts secret instructions in code to their contacts in China.
I issued a statement responding to this report, saying that the Voice of America reports about the sad news of self-immolations, but certainly does not encourage them. And as for secret messages, I called that idea bizarre and absurd. But the point is this: misinformation, dishonest spin is being actively peddled against the United States and against the VOA. America must have a strong voice responding to lies and reporting the truth. The people of Tibet and many other places in the world count on us for that. We do not need to match the Chinese dollar for dollar. Quite frankly, I think a lot of their money is being wasted. Propaganda will always be less credible and thus less powerful than honest reporting. It is likely, therefore, well, as I said. But soft power does matter, and we do need to do more. In a world where too many governments are still try to keep their people ignorant and afraid, VOA and its sister organizations, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, Middle East Broadcasting, and the Office of Cuban Broadcasting, all of us overseen by the U.S. Broadcasting Board of Governors. This group of broadcasters do work that is one of the nation's best investments. Around the world, VOA remains a trusted source of unfiltered news and information about America. For millions of people, it is a source of hope. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. But I realize I shouldn't, I don't know what the timetable is. In any case, yeah, okay, a couple of questions. Does anyone have one? Back in the back, please, on the left.
I had a question regarding VOA's work in Iran in particular. Are there any instances of people getting in trouble with the government for listening to the reports?
I haven't heard of them, and frankly, there's such a large number of people who do tune into our programming that it would be hard for them to punish even a measurable percentage of them. As I said, 20% of the country watches our television shows. We have tremendous, tremendous audience there. However, the families of some of our broadcasters have been threatened, have been jailed, have been interrogated. There are efforts to get at international broadcasters that way. And the same thing has happened to the BBC on an even larger scale than to us. So it is a struggle. And of course, as I mentioned, there's active jamming, sometimes increased when there's a story that they particularly don't want people to know about, that we're reporting about. So, it's a tense situation. People who work for VOA and report in Farsi do have to worry about their family's safety and other issues like that. But no, I haven't seen any reports of anyone being punished for listening or watching. Please.
So, Joseph May recently wrote an article on foreign policy about how China and Russia got soft power all wrong because they basically come from the government. It's government initiated. So I'm wondering what efforts the VOA has taken to involve the civil society overseas, specifically in China and Russia.
I haven't seen that article. I'm actually going to be seeing Zhou in a month, so I'll look for it. We're also a state broadcaster. We're not private. Although I spent most of my career in private broadcasting, commercial broadcasting, but VOA is a state broadcaster. But the difference is we have a firewall between, I'm not a spokesman for the president or the administration, and there's a firewall created by a board of governors that appointed me, who are half Republican, half Democrat. And I don't take any orders from anybody in the executive branch about what we report about. My journalists do old-fashioned journalism. They cover whatever they think is of interest to the market that they are serving. Sometimes there are stories on the Voice of America that don't please the White House or the State Department. They wish that we would play that down, and occasionally there are, phone calls. I generally ignore them because unless the journalism has something wrong with it, as journalism, it's not my job to control what the subjects or editorial line of Voice of America is, to the extent of making it fit any particular political line. That's why we have credibility. That's why we reach 150 million people a week, because people know that that's the case. That's the difference with RT and with CCTV, which I think is our greatest source of strength. Sometimes people on Capitol Hill don't, even some of our strongest supporters who believe in the Voice of America very, very much and are supporters of our funding, don't understand that particular point. Journalism is more powerful than propaganda, and it always will be. But I'm always having to make that point again. Please.
I know in China they censor like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube in a way it censor global communication. So what are the challenges and opportunities for VOA in China, a country that try to monitor its communication?
China is such a wonderful country, and such interesting things are happening there right now. It's such an engine of growth and change. And the young people want to know, like young people everywhere, they want to know more, and they want a better country. So I think our opportunities are in their energy and their desire to learn more about what other societies do, and not necessarily to copy us, but to know what we do, and maybe use parts of what we do in creating the China for the next generation. So I see a lot of opportunities there, but you're right. I mean, the Chinese government probably has 5 or 6 people trying to block our broadcasts for every one I have doing them, at least. The tremendous and very sophisticated censorship effort on the internet by the Chinese government. We spend, multiple millions circumventing that effort. And it's a cat and mouse game, and we're the mice. And I will just say this, I think the mice do okay. They do okay. The cat sometimes wins, but we do okay too. Please.
Talk a little bit about how you arrived at the figure of 20% audience in Iran.
We spend a fair amount of money getting the best possible polling that we can. And in different countries, the quality is different. North Korea, you've got to interview people coming across the border into China, which is not so easy and not very scientific. In Iran, we're able to do phone polls. We call thousands. I mean, we don't, but the company that we hire does. And actually, over the years, the numbers have gone up and down a little bit, but they're reasonably we think we have confidence in them. Let's put it that way. The numbers went down for a while when the jamming was really effective. Now it's less so, and the numbers are up. So I'm reasonably confident in them. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We're now going to be beginning our first panel, which is on the domestic dimensions of public diplomacy. The director of the Master of Public Diplomacy program, Dr. Nick Cull, will be leading the discussion.
It's a pleasure to be chairing this panel and to be introducing 2 of my colleagues in the field of public diplomacy, and 2 people who are also good friends. And I'd like to first of all introduce Zaharna, who is Associate Professor of Communication at American University, and you will know Professor Zaharna from her book Battles to Bridges, which was I think one of the best books maybe that's come out on public diplomacy since 9/11, looking at both the way that the United States has attempted to engage the Middle East and more effective ways that it could do so. And Professor Zaharna has been a fellow of the Center and has your perspectives on public diplomacy now been published?
Yes.
Yes, it's just out. Yes, so this
Cultural
is
Awakening.
You've been working on some of the looking or re-examining the cultural dimension of public diplomacy, to look at it not only as culture as an element that can be shared, but actually a culture as a dimension of our understanding that has to be explored and figured into our approach.
And let me go plug for Amelia, one of your students. Her book, Ali and Amelia and I, Networking Relational Person.
That's out when?
Next week.
Terrific. And then on my left-hand side, Professor Xinyu from Beijing Foreign Studies University. And it's a special pleasure to introduce Professor Zhou because he is director of the master's program in public diplomacy at Beijing Foreign Studies, and so is my Chinese equivalent. And we met in Korea back in, I think it was in October. And it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce him to you. And I look forward not only to what he has to say and to his, we're hoping that his book will become available in, his book on Chinese public diplomacy will become available in English at some point, but we're able to hear from him directly today, and that it will be possible to have contact with his students and to explore, jointly with them in some way in the future, our shared understanding of this subject so important to us of public diplomacy. And Professor Zhou has been staying with me for the last couple of days, and it's been a pleasure to show him something of Los Angeles. So thank you for coming. So before we begin the discussion, I just wanted to make a couple of points about the emergence of the domestic dimension in public diplomacy, because for a long time the domestic was left off the agenda when we came to talk about public diplomacy. And the reason for this was largely something that David Ensor alluded to, and that is United States legislation. The Smith-Mont Act meant that American public diplomacy couldn't address a domestic audience, and therefore in American public diplomacy theory there was a sharp distinction between public affairs, which was for government communication to a domestic audience, and public diplomacy, which was government communication to a foreign audience. Unfortunately, or fortunately, that doesn't, and that is not the way the real world works. It doesn't. It shouldn't even have. American doctrine didn't even make that much sense, which is why the law's being changed. But scholars in public diplomacy have had to break away from that rather narrow understanding of public diplomacy and understand the extent to which the domestic dimension is critical to success in public diplomacy. And the most obvious way of thinking about this is when we factor in the subject which Professor Jay Wong has done so much to explicate for us, the subject, the idea of the brand and the national brand, because any brand has two dimensions: the brand that you send overseas, that you talk about overseas, and then the way in which you bring your domestic population, or if you're a company, your workers behind the idea of the brand and ensure brand integrity. And at the most fundamental level, the domestic dimension of public diplomacy is ensuring that your domestic population live the brand. There's much more to it than that, and I hope we will be able to explore that in this discussion. But I'll pass the floor now to Professor Zaharna to talk us through the domestic dimension of public diplomacy. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. And those were very kind, generous words. Thank you. And I want to thank the Association of Public Diplomacy Scholars for this kind invitation. It's wonderful being here, and I am going to talk about the weather in the campus. And I'm walking around yesterday, I was this is I'm in heaven, but if it would only rain. So, and I'm also very proud of my association with the Center on Public Diplomacy, and I'm grateful for being able to do the research on culture, doing the cultural underbelly of public diplomacy. I've noticed over the past decade, there's been a tremendous surge in interest in public diplomacy that's universal, almost universal, but the understanding of public diplomacy and concepts can be quite divergent. And that divergent to me is a clue that culture may be at work, which not be surprising because public diplomacy as a communication and political phenomena is doubly influenced by culture. And one area that has been coming for diversion is the view of publics
And are we on to the next screen? Okay. It's the view of the publics. And today I want to look at different views of the public, and my work on the cultural underbelly is learning from other countries and cultures. It's not just about, but learning from. And so what I want to do today is go through some of the divergent views and then applying them to different scenarios. The traditional, as Professor Cull was saying, or Nick? Professor Cull was saying, is initially assume when we said who was the public, it's foreign publics. A former CPD fellow, Kathy Fitzpatrick, when she did her study, said there's divergent views on the concept of public diplomacy, but there's widespread agreement that we're talking about foreign publics and not domestic publics. And next, and this assumption that it's foreign publics, it fits with when you look at diplomacy. It's the sending nation and the receiving nation. In public diplomacy, it would be the sending nation and receiving public. In communication, there's the old model, the sender and receiver. But the basic, what I want to draw attention to, is they're two separate entities and sending a message. And of course it would be the external, because why would you send something to yourself? So that external. The next, when we move into countries like Asia and Africa, the greater Middle East, and we ask who's the public, what we're seeing here, or what's often talked about, the assumption that the domestic is not only included, but it has a very privileged position. It's as if public diplomacy begins with the domestic and radiates outward. And again, if you look at models, the dominant models are, there's the idea of relationalism. I can't see, but y'all have a picture of a blue. The idea of relationalism, that everything is connected. And this was a Chinese scholar, he even speaks of concentric circles of interpersonal relations that radiate out, and then they overlap with the circles of others. So this connectedness. Going to the next, I present these views not as opposite, because communication is always about sending messages on some parts, information transfer, as well as relational. So it's not an either or, but a both. And my goal in doing this research is to expand the vision of public diplomacy. And so what I want to do now is turn to the pivotal role of the domestic public in the public diplomacy equation. And I have up here Indonesia, because this is one of the first things that I learned. I mean, that first came when I was, to my attention about the domestic, is a student turned in a report, and they were doing nation branding, and they had this Indonesia, and the tagline is celebrating 100 years of national awakening, which is a political tagline. It was the campaign was for a foreign audience, but the tagline was quite for the domestic public. So I want to go through 5, I say applications, context, I couldn't find a better word, but maybe we'll find one, of looking at the pivotal role. So one, which is exactly what Professor Cull was talking about, is a lot of public diplomacy is the national image and national identity. And most of the public campaigns, they promote their people and culture as part of their campaign, but a lot of times, or most of the time, the people are not included in the design and implementation of that campaign. And I have South Africa here, and we were playing videos. I would have the video here. But I have South Africa because South Africa is one of the countries that routinely puts its domestic public as part of that public diplomacy equation in nation branding. The next slide, we see the importance where the domestic was not included. We have Cool Britannia, which did not go over so well, and Korea Sparkling, which I understood was a translation, and then they said there's sparkling water, sparkling wine, but Korea is not. And then my all-time favorite, if y'all have not seen this, you have to get this video on YouTube. This is Visit Denmark, and Karen is trying to find the father of her baby after a one-night stand, and so that was how they were promoting Visit Denmark, which did not go over well at all. So, but you can find it, and they've had several knockoffs now of Karen trying to find her father for the baby. So, the next one, looking at the pivotal role, partnerships. And this is the positive role, domestic role, a domestic organization partnering to extend the public diplomacy reach as well as the public diplomacy credibility of nations. So there's more than that, but these are the two that hits. The next slide, stakeholders. Not all domestic public ties there are positive. And I should say this as an aside, public diplomacy scholarship, I think, tends to focus on the positive and the apolitical, and try to overlook the negative and the political, the contentious, which is odd when you consider public diplomacy as a political tool. But here I have public diplomacy stakeholders, and a stakeholder is any group that may feel that they have a stake in the initiative or the issue. And the danger of overlooking these, and also the response strategies. Trying to discredit these groups may be counterproductive. They can backfire because the groups, because they are domestic, can have more credibility. So this is an area to watch. The next slide, and my math is not so good. I think it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So, and that's not my specialty. So are we on to the domestic?
Yes.
And diaspora? And that should be number 4. But I only go as high as 3, so. All right, so anyway, one country's domestic is often another country's diaspora. And here we see the diaspora playing a positive bridging role. And this is a positive sense of the public diplomacy. Also, to keep in mind, the diaspora can play an adversarial role. And this is the digital diaspora, and that's something that I've been working on, how the digital diaspora can try to undermine the diplomacy of a country. Next, and 5, this is the policy factor. And here I put Japan as an example with its Mideast initiative. And this is the soccer match they have the Japanese playing Iraq. It was not just sending and trying to sending the message out to the Iraqi public, but trying to inform the Japanese public about Japan's Middle East policy. And this was especially in Iraq when it sent peacekeeping troops. And there was an aggressive attempt by the government to try to inform the Japanese public about why they were there, about the culture of the people themselves, and then they brought over the Iraqi team, and then they had information programs. So I put this here that by informing the domestic, it's expanding the policy bandwidth, because the domestic public can put a constraint on what may be foreign policy options. And so by including the domestic, it's possible to possibly expand the policy bandwidth. So those are some of the applications, and I put them there to see about expanding the vision of public diplomacy and the public diplomacy equation, having a broader vision and a more comprehensive vision. And I'm moving now to the next slide. I think we're up there where it says frontline public diplomacy. Okay, frontline public diplomacy. What's interesting about frontline public diplomacy, I equate it with crisis. In crisis, humans, and I put nations as collectives of humans, in a crisis or tense situation tend to fall back on what is familiar. they tend to become rigid, repetitive, and difficult to come up with creative options. My classic example is, Dad, can I borrow the car? No. But Dad, I really, no. Dad, but really, it's hot. No. Rigid, repetitive, less able to think of creative option, and falling back on the familiar, And I want to look at two examples. And one will be a close-up look of the domestic, and the other one will be looking at foreign and totally missing. So the first one, next, crisis blind spot is China 2008 Olympic. The falling back on the familiar would be relying on the domestic as a way of reaching out to the key foreign publics. And here this was the great attention played to even down to the detail of the taxi cab drivers and the taxis, because they would be coming in contact with the foreigner, and being completely blindsided almost by the backlash of foreign activists, as when there was the relay torch. So this was the crisis blind spot of being too focused on the domestic public. The next one is the blind side of domestic oversight. And this was U.S. post 9/11 public diplomacy in the Islamic world. President Bush said we have to do a better case of getting our, we have to do a better job of getting our case out. And so there was this surge to get information out, the radio, the television. This particular image is from the Shared Values Initiative, which was an advertising campaign, and the goal was to show American religious tolerance. And as you can see, the problem was there was a dramatic increase in anti-Muslim sentiment. And so what was happening, it was contradicting the message and affecting U.S. credibility. So, PD lessons, I guess the takeaway is the necessity of including the domestic public in the public diplomacy equation, really all publics in the equation, and looking for the different approaches. I have here, we have the Confucius Institute of the reaching out, relying on that relational approach, as well as what's become an interest, discursive power, which I call assertive public diplomacy, and this is to get the message out to foreign publics. Then on the other, the relational approach with the U.S. going more from an information to relational, and this is from the image there is the National Endowment of Humanities. It's the bridging cultures, trying to inform the American public about different cultures and people. So in summary, the takeaway, what can we learn not just about other cultures and perspectives of public diplomacy, what we can learn from. And here the takeaway also is the pivotal role, being alert to the pivotal role of the domestic public and all publics, positive, negative, adversarial in the public diplomacy equation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, shall we pass straight over to Professor Zhou?
Thank you, Nick. Good morning, professors and speakers, boys and girls. As Nick mentioned before, we established this year the first master program on public diplomacy in China. So I always told Nick that you are the world first, and we are the China's first. So if we can cooperate in some ways, it's a communication between China and the world. So I think that is the reason Nick asked me come to speak here. Thank you. It's a joke, and Nick asked me to talk about China's domestic public diplomacy. We discussed China's domestic politics shortly last October in Seoul. At that time, China's national power transition had not actually completed. Nowadays, we see Chinese new President Xi Jinping took over all the power. During his first months of office, President Xi seemed to have made a great resolution on public diplomacy. In his inauguration speech on November 16th last year, he mentioned the importance of mutual communication and understanding between China and the world. Several days later, he met dozens of foreign experts and professors who work in Chinese universities as his first official activities related to foreign affairs. These signs never came before. So 1.5 months ago, the president of China visited Russia and 3 African countries with the help of his charming wife, Pamela, if you can see the picture of her. The journey became a cultural and public diplomacy exercises for the new administration's foreign strategy. However, President Xi faces some troubles. I'm not him, and he hasn't got a good chance to tell me how he feels. But I think he's annoyed by some troubles in his efforts to make China more understandable to the rest of the world. The problem is that saying in recently internet Chinese words like it's in China is 这不是一个人的战斗. That is, this should not be a single man's battle, and it should not be the battle of just the leaders or the government of China. In China, we talk about traditional public diplomacy and new public diplomacy. Traditionally, government and big news agencies transmit information directly to the audience abroad. In the 1980s and 90s, VOA and Radio Free Asia broadcast every day to Chinese audience, which was illegal in terms of Chinese government. I'm sorry. During these years, millions of Chinese people got up early to secretly listen to the programs, many pieces of which were about how bad our communist government was and could possibly be. Recently, VOA was reported to stop their radio service to China. Is that true? I'm sorry.
No,
No?
But there have been attempts to reduce it. It's kind of in debate.
Yeah.
The fewer people listen to the radio now, shortwave radio.
Yeah.
So they're reducing that.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that. I think this event symbolized an end to the old pattern. Now Chinese government worried about the message from the internet and social media. In social media, it is neither only about President Obama or Hillary Clinton post hostile words about China, nor a huge news agency broadcasting unfriendly information. Today it is about the communication between ordinary Chinese and ordinary Americans. If you still see new public diplomacy as a battle between governments, which Nick may strongly oppose, you can neither attack nor defend without influences on your own people. That is the very thing what President Xi worry about. Actually, Chinese government is smart enough to understand the importance of domestic communication. We established the National Public Diplomacy Association this year, whereas several local public diplomacy associations had been established earlier. You can see on my PPT on this slide, which I list all the backgrounds of the 64 founding members of the National PD Association. Transnational corporations, think tanks, social luminaries are embraced to contribute to the public diplomacy through this kind of non-government organization. If you remember the former NBA superstar Yao Ming, he now is the vice president of the Public Diplomacy Association of Shanghai. You can see the picture on my PPT. So I think the first thing he should do in China is to find a good photographer. He always
Definitely available.
He always embarrassed the photographer. You see the picture? So this is China's new strategy. First step is to influence domestic society. Second step is to transfer public diplomacy information abroad through people-to-people communications, which happen every day both on the internet and actual life, including the 60 million person times traveling abroad every year from China. This is not a game between President Xi to the world, it's a game between Chinese people to the world. Sounds like a smart strategy, though not an innovative one. Actually, US, UK, Japan, and other countries has commenced on domestic public diplomacy for years. Chinese government soon found that communicating to the domestic society is a pretty hard task. In a modern domestic society, government can largely dictate their foreign policy and views on the outside world just to their own people. There must be plenty of well-planned communications, education, and persuasions. You may think China is not a democratic country. Yes, maybe you're right, but I will argue that China has already had an open society now. Domestic public diplomacy of China confronts similar challenges to that of American, and there are some special problems for Chinese government even. In my following presentation, I will talk more about the perception gaps in Chinese society. In this particular case, perceptional gaps means the huge differences of views on what kind of country China really is. The first perceptional gap is between Chinese people and people in the rest of the world. What kind of country is China? People may think differently, but particularly I found there's a big differences of view between people living in China and the people out of it. When I visited the Pakistan tribe area 2 years before, which is a remote mountainous province near to Afghanistan, and I hear the governors say China is superpower. This is not just a diplomatic language of a third world country. When I was in Korea last year, Korean people said they are a bridge linking China and US. And that is what the elites of world's 15th largest economy think about. However, do you know how Chinese people think of their country's standards in the world? Much more modest, maybe even too modest. In China, the word of superpower especially refers to the US. China is the biggest developing country, biggest country with biggest problems. And the primary aim of Chinese foreign policy is to protect ourselves, is to protect the country from any invasion and oppression from those Western developed powers. As we are running out of time, I will not elaborate on the reasons for the perceptional gap about China, domestic and abroad, but it brings problems to Chinese public diplomacy. When the international community argued China to take responsibilities on climate change, rebalancing of the world trade and the development of the underdeveloped countries, Chinese people bring up agendas domestically like stronger protection of national interests, including the barren islands on the southern China Sea. I don't think this means Chinese people are selfish in nature or Chinese government deliberately stimulate the nationalist emotion. The reason roots deeply in culture and history memories and now cause problems for China's public diplomacy. The second perceptual gap is among Chinese people ourselves. Different groups of people view their country differently, and in China, this is more and more an acute and complicated issue. People live in China countryside and those live in cities might draw utterly opposite images of China. In the same prosperous city, because of complicated economic and social problems, even people of different ages may give you different pictures about the country, and may be different from the situation in U.S. Chinese people seems not to share much common political value. On the internet, Chinese people easily get frustrated to discuss public issues with others because they don't have basic consensus on meanings of words and values such as the democracy, freedom, equality, and communism. President Xi and his colleagues actually have to communicate with a much more pluralist and complicated society when they would like to make some consistent Chinese image and values for the development of the public diplomacy to the world. The last perceptual gap I want to talk about is among Chinese elites. What is the message about Chinese foreign policy and the aims in the world that Chinese government want to get across to its own people and people outside the country? Less consensus ever. I know in U.S. Democrats and the Republicans quarreled with each other endlessly. However, they all share the ideology of liberalist democracy. In China, it's different. We have 自由派, that is liberalist, 左派, which is the communist, if you know who Bolshevik is, 新左派, and which is often regarded as nationalists, and 官派 or 官学, which mostly refers to those pragmatic and ideology-free technical bureaucrats, and 新儒家, like those people try to resolve the country's serious problems according to the traditional Confucianism. These people are all in the government or are pretty influential to the policy. Do you know how President Xi Jinping was elected in a small group as the new president of China? Because all the clans think Xi is their own person. So if you ask these people, these elites, ask them how China came to its today's success, they give you different answers. When you ask them what the country is now doing to move forward, they will give you different answers. When you ask about the future of China, they will also respond differently. The only common sense in China among the elites is we can change. Yes, we can. We must change. Yeah. I would like to share with you how complicated China is. Some people say China is not a typical national state. It is a continent like Europe. In such a huge and complicated country, public diplomacy is a difficult course of development. As the beginning of my statement, I introduced to the new Chinese administration's recent efforts on public diplomacy. I strongly suggest you to keep your attention on China. Years later, we might see how public diplomacy is developed into a successful new pattern in a country with more than 1 billion people. That's all my statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we're drawing these two presentations together. We have some very interesting points. And one thing that's clear is that the external perception of a country is based not just on the words, but on the relationships between the citizens and the different groups in that society and the outside world, and not just on what we say, but on what we do. Well, it's funny, you're talking about the Chinese going overseas, and I've been working in South Africa, where a number of Chinese visitors have been going. It's an increasingly popular holiday resort, and on behalf of a number of South African waiters, can I say the image of China would be greatly improved if they would pick up the habit of tipping. And equally, I've been doing some work with colleagues from Mexico, and one of the questions that was asked to me by Mexican students was, why do Americans behave so badly when they visit Mexico? And I said, do you mean the old guys with the hats and the golf clubs? And they said, no, we like them. We like the government, we like the old people. It's the young people, it's the spring breakers who think that Mexico is some sort of parallel universe where they can get as drunk as they like and do whatever they want, and without consequence. And so as we think about our public diplomacy, we have to think about ways in which the behavior, even of our own behavior ourselves, impacts. And one of the most unpopular things I say to people in California is that how you treat the people who work for you, who may not have documents, affects the image of your country. How you treat if you are a liberal who gives money to President Obama, but you still discriminate against your gardener, an undocumented migrant, and they write home and say Americans are racist, that is going to be much more credible than what President Obama says when he's in visiting Mexico City. And because the messages that travel along these relational links are essential. Now, some countries, as we know, have been following on what Rhonda was saying, have been trying to create boards to manage their international image that will draw together government voices, civil society voices, and corporate voices. This has been particularly strong in Scandinavia, where they've created sort of bureaucracies for international projection. And Sweden took a bold move to trust that its own people would be able to represent the country, and they created a Twitter feed called @Sweden, and where each week a different Swede would represent the country overseas. And when this idea came out, myself and Ali Fisher and other people who believe in relational public diplomacy thought this was a great idea. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked out. That it turns out that you cannot simply just turn over your representation to the people, and because it may be that the first 40 people who do this do it with respect for the image of the country, but it turns out number 41 will think this is my chance to tell the world how Swedes really actually prefer to be around people with blonde hair and blue eyes, and don't like foreigners, don't like external influences, wish to assert themselves and communicate a less attractive side of the country. So there are lessons there as well as hope in the idea of allowing the people, bringing the people into public diplomacy, there are some lessons there too. With regard to China, I think one of the bottom lines is what the Chinese government is finding is that it is very hard to be one thing, especially when you represent a quarter or effectively, what was it, 1 in 5 human beings? A vast percentage of the world's population are located in China and more overseas of the Chinese diaspora. It's very hard to be one thing. But my response to that would be that they have to learn to be many things, and it has to be okay to present China as many things. Because once you bring the resource of Chinese diversity, of the many different cities, the many different cultures within China, China will be less scary. Because part of the problem here is the scale of China is so intimidating to people around the world that they see it as more, the Chinese people understand themselves that they're not actually that powerful, they're not actually that scary, but to an external audience, it's very frightening. European Union is not intimidating, even though it's the world's largest economy. In fact, people don't even talk about it as the world's largest economy, maybe because it isn't a very good economy right now, but it's still bigger than the US economy, it's still bigger than the Chinese economy, but it doesn't intimidate anyone, because when people look, they see the diversity. They see 27 countries, they see 500 world-class cities, they see 250 regions. They don't see this intimidating thing. And if people saw more diversity in China, if the voices of the regions could speak for China, the China would be less intimidating, and we could talk about other things and actually begin to build relationships, because actually relationships are built in units of one. Yeah. That when we can have a relationship with our Chinese peer, we see we have more in common with one another than with other people, and enough of those relationships, enough peer-to-peer relationships with people who happen to be located in these other places, that will begin to build sort of bonds that can give us a little bit of what we really need, which is stability and trust. And the bottom line is that we're trying to create an atmosphere of trust where peace can flourish. And isn't it strange how seldom anybody uses that word around here? But I think, this is in the end of the day, our goal is peace, and we're here to build peace and true understanding and true relationships. Yes, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just quickly to address one point that you raised as an example, that is the role of people, that is more broadly than governments and other institutions, in fostering or in some cases undermining the image of one country in another. And you gave a specific example of the American spring breakers in Mexico behaving so badly in that forms. I think it goes both ways, even in that example. And the relationship is so dense between Mexico and the United States, that is, it is so pervasive, it has so many connections, that there's really a good basis there for arguing that the two states need to work together and with their societies to try to dismantle some of these problems, because policies are really constrained on both sides. U.S. policies towards Mexico are constrained by attitudes towards Mexico and vice versa. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs just released a survey showing that American perceptions of Mexico are at the lowest point since they started taking this survey in 1994. That just came out this week. But just to give you to touch a specific example, the tourist industry, or certain elements of the tourist industry in Mexico, cultivate this spring break excessive culture. And I've seen it. I can give you exactly the example I'm talking about it. I've seen it in really inappropriate situations in which it's not during spring breakers are not around, and the people handling, say, a snorkeling tour, and you're out on the boat, they actually want you to engage in drinking games. And if they can get somebody to do it, they'll reward that person. The way they stroke them is to say, oh, this guy must be really Mexican, right? It's really damaging to the image. But it's that reciprocal reinforcement, that cultivating simply for business purposes. They want that sort of a party. And I think it really has done some damage.
Thank you for that. And I think this business of connections through people will be a major part of the diaspora panel this afternoon. But that's really depressing to hear that Jose Cuerva is these corporations that have an interest in the drinking image of Mexico are harming the image. And this is one of the brings us to this issue of bringing all sectors of a country in around the domestic aspect. And we cannot have one part of a country's image actually undercutting another part. The tourist brand can't undercut the industrial brand, or you're headed for disaster. Other comments on questions to our panelists? Yes.
You were talking earlier about the value of expressing the diversity within China and compared it to the EU, and you were mentioning that sort of there is less a perception of fear with regard to the EU than there might be with China. I wonder if some of that might also have to do with just a history of having interacted with those nations in a more involved way, or a feeling of knowing or sort of relationship, and how, if at all, that might influence it, and how that can be applied to the case of China moving forward.
I think up to a point, but in fact, some people with negative histories with Europe are unintimidated by the European Union, and with zero interaction with China are not attracted to China. It isn't. Whilst there's something to what you're saying, there's also something to when we look at what intimidates people around the world. There seems to be an absolute correlation between force or perception of power and intimidation. The more powerful you are, the less people like you. And if you can show that your power is moderated in some way, people like you more. Even this applies in American popular culture. Superman would be unbearable were it not for kryptonite. So it's okay to talk. Not only is it okay to talk about your weaknesses, it's actually essential for people admiring you to be aware of your limits and weaknesses. And so I think we have, as part of getting to know a person, part of building a relationship, would you really want a relationship with somebody who could do everything? Like, even the genie of the lamp can only give you 3 wishes. You have to have these. We have to be aware of limits and weaknesses and so forth. Xinyu.
Yeah. I think if you live in, I hope you have a chance to live in China. Chinese people really have a national image, but that is really a short one in terms of the history. And before that, Chinese people really live locally, and they say we are Cantonese, or we are Sichuan, or we are Shandong, or different parts of China. I think it's after the invasion of the Japanese army 100 years ago, that is a really consolidation of the country's, the country's nationalist image. So the problem is the Chinese local people can really hardly communicate with the rest of the world. If you come to China, you will communicate with them, and you will feel China's different, so differentiated areas. But they cannot communicate actively because of the language. You can hear my English language. I came from the best language university in China, but you can hear my English language. It's still, And for common people, it's hard for language, it's hard for cultural understanding. But I think awesome, right? Because if China is so large, and as I said, the large country has many kinds of problems in it. Like US is a large country. Most Americans don't really care about what happens in the world because you have many problems domestically, right? So China is the same country. If the people from the rest part of the world can understand China is such a huge country with many problems, with more than 1 billion people, they have different minds, they have different requirements to the government and society, they have different culture and language. In China, language is just like Europe. You can understand each other. Yeah.
Rhonda.
I wasn't going to respond to that. I was going to respond to something you said.
Okay, well, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to draw attention when you said, when you're talking about the gardener, and that the power of messages that travel along relational links. And then you said the gardener, you gave the example of the gardener, and how that would contradict the president. Well, think about that. One is commander-in-chief, and one is just a person like the other. So that is really the power when you have the power of a known person and how much money the U.S. spends on public diplomacy, and you have the communicator-in-chief versus the gardener. So that is just pulling that insight out, which I thought was pretty.
This is a problem, and when we're talking
It's
about
a problem,
the U.S.
but
military, the U.S. military have these put a lot of attention to the representation of the top, but they're only your credibility is limited by the youngest, drunkest sergeant on leave and how they behave. And this was a problem for the U.S. in the Philippines in the 1950s, where they had 3 car accidents with drunk Americans in the space of like a month, and that became a public diplomacy problem for the U.S. You can't just rely on it's not just what you say, it's what you do, and what you do, and how you are, your attitudes, and not just the attitudes of the people at the top of your society.
I have there's lots of questions.
Do you want to? Yes, do you want to? Yes.
Me? Sorry. So being from Hong Kong, I really understand like the perception gap that you mentioned about people within China. How will you see the role of public diplomacy in expanding, building consensus within people in China, like even in Hong Kong or Taiwan? And what is the role of public diplomacy in China?
I think, yeah, in terms of Taiwan and the Hong Kong case, there's a perceptual gap between the mainland and the different areas. So I think it's hard to really build a consensus on what we are and what's the core value of China. Definitely, in the short future, it's hard to build real consensus. But I think there should be some education and some practices on how people communicate with the world about China. At least you should know what kind of thing you cannot to tell, to talk about. And you should know you cannot only express yourself, your own feelings in a public diplomacy occasion. As a person you can talk freely, but as a citizen, I know it's a really Chinese sport about this collective responsibility. As a citizen, when you talk to foreigners, it's not just about yourself, your own sort. You at least should know something you cannot really talk about it. And the first thing I think is Chinese people should have more chances and approaches to learn more about China, to learn different parts of China. I said it's a huge country. People live locally. They just know what happened to their life. But people live in Shanghai, which is a really modernized area. They have too less knowledge about people living in Gansu, these poor provinces. So the first thing for Chinese is to learn more about our own country and speak carefully. Don't hurt or don't make mistakes or misunderstanding on the cross-cultural occasions. Is that mine?
Yeah, I mean, education had played a role in last year when they were trying to implement basically a nationalist education
I know that.
in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And it didn't went well at all. And I don't think, what is your view on like not being open about our views of China would help China, or will it hurt China in the long term? Because what you're saying is, if we're not talking about the bad things in China as Chinese citizens.
I didn't mean that. Bad things is a part of China, but you should talk about the bad things and the good things, the best parts and the worst parts. And if you have the capability to manage the whole image of China, the whole situation of China, you can talk more correctly or more modest. That is education about. When you come to the college, you don't learn one kind of theory. You learn different kinds of thoughts. Then you have the power, you have the capability to teach, to command, to make statements. So that's the same in China. Yes, you wanted to.
I have a question regarding your point of highlighting Chinese diversity.
Yeah.
And for the external world. But I'm curious though, if you were pushing for diversity while trying to create a more domestically incorporated public diplomacy image, sort of going to what you were saying, incorporating more of the domestic outlook, trying to push for more of the people inside of it. But I was under the interpretation that since China is such a diverse area, particularly relating to China, one of the things that would strengthen their public diplomacy is by showing that although there was a lot of a lot of cultural identity, the national identity itself is still not overpowered by that. But wouldn't pushing the national image from a public diplomacy image of a hugely diverse China can add the national identity for the Chinese?
But this is the problem. I think you've hit on a problem. But the reason that the world, right now, the Chinese government has has a dream of how it wants to represent China, and its dream is of all these a billion people all doing the same thing, all marching together, all unified. And the West has a nightmare of China, and that is a billion people all marching together, all unified. And the reality is different. And all I'm saying is that the Chinese government would do better to talk about the reality than try and sell a dream, which is actually the nightmare of the world and doesn't happen to be true. So, so I think this idea of a unified national, you can have a national identity that includes within it plurality, and at the moment the reality is most people in this room, even though some of us have studied a lot of international affairs, we couldn't populate a map of China with more than 2 or 3 city names or province names at all, let alone with any accuracy. And you know, that is I think that's a real problem. If we had a list that collectively tried to think how many Chinese people could we think of, we can't think of that many people. And this is something's out of balance. Something's out of balance here. So, but Sarah, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, slightly different
So
question.
Dr. Sarah Graham visiting from Australia, so
That's
thank
right.
you for coming, sir.
The domestic dimension of PD that I'm really fascinated by is money and the resources available to various states to pursue PD, if we define it as sort of government-run or orchestrated communication. And what are you seeing in this era of fiscal uncertainty and fiscal austerity about what states are devoting to public diplomacy, the resources they're devoting? Because my sense would be, and I haven't looked at the figures, but a lot of middling states like Japan, Australia, Britain, European countries would be cutting back. We've certainly cut back in Australia our foreign aid, which is, I think, where a lot of our public diplomacy works through our foreign aid agency. So in that sense, in terms of that crucial domestic reality, which is a domestic constituency for spending, is there a problem here? And I think the trend is once you cut this stuff, it's so hard to get it back in, you know? So I don't know, what's your senses on those sort of spending patterns?
I'm getting at the thing on that is, I think brings back more than the money is the relational power, and then also the creativity. Because you can have a problem and throw a lot of money at it, or, and that's why I put the different things up there, you can have a broader perspective and bring in more creativity. And that will be in the innovative partnerships. That would be in the innovation using the diaspora. And also watching out for the adversarial, like focusing on the positive and what can we do to get the message out and make things wonderful, when a lot of times in image building, the biggest setback are the negatives, because people tend to focus on the negatives, and the negatives often receive more attention. So even cutting back on the negatives. So it's not just, I don't see it as, there's a money issue, but there's also creativity in a broader spectrum. That's just the way I see it.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that and say that it may be that the budget cuts which are happening are, they could perversely, and in some places, be one of the best things that's happened to public diplomacy, because it forces governments to realize that they have to public diplomacy has to be about partnership. And in the UK now, the word partnership is in the definition of public diplomacy. Engagement and partnership are right up there when they talk about what the public diplomacy division of the Foreign Office, or Foreign Commonwealth Office does. And because, you know, in a world of networks, we are able to connect for the first time in history to the people we find most credible, and that is people like ourselves. But if everybody's connecting to somebody like themselves and getting their message and their tweets and their newspaper cuttings and everything from somebody who's like themselves, that's a problem for a public diplomacy agency, which is necessarily not like the people it's trying to communicate with. That's the whole point of communicating with a foreign audience. So therefore, you have to find somebody who's credible to your audience, partner with them, and find ways of introducing your material onto networks so that it will be passed along. And this is what VOA has been able to do so effectively, creating little packets of media that will be circulated by the people because they like it and because it's relevant to them. So working through partnerships, thinking about networks, partnering with the people who have the money, if it's not the governments that have the money, working with other partners, bringing in non-governmental organizations that often have so much more credibility, bringing in citizens who have credible voices, and I don't think it's necessarily a step backwards. It could be that this is the moment that we can have a creative response that can make public diplomacy more than it's been in the past, and actually maybe even rescue public diplomacy from its history, which isn't always a... But David, you wanted to...
Well, responding to your point. I meet every year with the Directors General of the other Western state broadcasters. And recently, Australia and Japan joined us. It had previously been a smaller group, like mostly Europeans and Americans. And we talk, and what we're talking about in the last 2 years is budget cuts. Yeah. And because the budget cuts are so large, we're having to partner with each other to have any impact at all in certain places, you know. And we're getting out of each other's way, and we're trying to sort of collaborate. Those of us who share values shaped around democracy and free markets, at least. So I don't know where it's going to all head, but there's that. The other thing I would just like to say is that I think as communications become so much easier for the little guy with the internet site in somewhere in China, you know, to have an impact through more of China, even maybe globally, or pick another place, you know, somewhere in the U.S. Something like Voice of America or the U.S. government or the Chinese government, it's not going to be possible to do all of your public diplomacy yourself anymore. Willy-nilly, there are going to be a lot of people who represent your country, whether you like it or not, like the Swedish guy, you may not like it, but he's there, who will be part of the image of your country. So you have to reach more broadly and have a broader kind of conversation that involves more people. In the case of Voice of America, I'm focusing a lot of attention on the diasporas in the United States. I see them as a force multiplier. If they say things about America that may be favorable, or about some of the values that we have here that may be favorable, that's got more credibility, perhaps, than Voice of America by itself can. I think the same is true, as you said, for the Chinese. If there's a more diverse set of different people from around China talking about what they like or don't like about China, or what they're worried about in their lives, somehow that will have greater credibility than the message from CCTV on high. And over time, it's a better way to go. And there's no choice in the matter anyway. So, Alex.
Yes, my question's related to this idea of reaching a broader audience, and my question is for Dr. Zaharna. You mentioned that you're doing research now focusing on digital diasporas, and you mentioned them in the context of being possible negative agents that undermine the state. I'm interested actually in thinking about how they could be positive contributions to enhancing and promoting America's image abroad and other countries abroad. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts more about the negative opportunities and the positive opportunities that engaging with digital diasporas can bring to the table.
Okay. What I say about the digital diaspora, and you know, really, it's the same tool that can make it positive or negative. And I was thinking specifically about, I think I'm going to say Eritrea. And what it is the diaspora, these were in the U.S., and they were creating these portals and these forums for them to talk about what was happening in the home country. And some of it was very negative against the government. And they felt now that we're on the digital, we're out of the way of the arm of the government, so we can say whatever we want to say, and they said a lot. And then they started organizing and then putting up the messages. So that would be the negative, undermining. The positive could be that for the same thing, creating a positive platform on the internet, and having that as the image, getting that out. So that would be the positive side, and then we're getting recruits for that. So this is the positive and negative. And I'm thinking also of Syria, because that was a lot of what had been going on there, had been things that were being posted on YouTube, also creating websites to bring in people. So that's what I'm thinking there.
That brings us to time. So I'd like to thank the panelists for their insightful presentations, and for you, the audience, for wonderful questions. I'd like to thank those who are watching on the live stream, and those who are out there in the Twitterverse, following along. So it's great to have so many people contributing, but thanks again to the panel. Thank you.
Check. Check.
XH is a J. It's in Albania. Alright, well, the part of my presentation actually is going to be about diaspora.
Oh, very good.
But it's not the full study.
Very good. I would love to see that.
two. Check one, check two.
David, the easiest place to get a cab, did you stay at the Radisson? There's still one kind over there. Usually cab. Yeah. There's usually one at Okay, good. Good seeing you. Take care.
Before you escape, I would like to speak to David. I don't know.